speaking of defunding the police, going to start with a nice simple basic on it. Demystifying defunding the police. One of the things I say to a lot of people, one will just be like, no, well, what's the this on this and that? What's that? I have a lot of students, that they're just been like, who's the first person to ever sing this song in this musical? And I'm like, that's an excellent question. I'm so glad you asked it. Google it. Type it into Google and see what you get when you first start with that search. So, first thing I want to do is just have us look at a page that says, defund the police, meaning. And I love this definition right here from Forbes. In its most general definition, defund the police means to redirect some funds for police departments to other areas such as education and healthcare, while its most radical interpretation calls for completely dismantling police departments and replacing it with social services-based approach, which, as it goes on to say, is what they're talking about doing in Minneapolis. And what's happening in Minneapolis is definitely going to be a guinea pig in some ways. It's going to be our chance to see, like, well, how does this interpretation work? Most people advocating defund the police are not doing it, here I gotta turn off my stop sharing, I was trying to get back to our faces, are not saying it to entirely dismantle the police department. This comes back to language, this comes back to phrasing, this comes back to the fight we were talking about last week of all lives matter, and Black lives matter, and blue lives matter. That when we say Black lives matter, it's not saying that only Black lives matter. We know all lives matter, but we know that Black lives are especially in danger right now. Defund the police, as like the hashtag is trending, is a less sophisticated version of that principle. It's a less sophisticated version of that principle. Because defund the police means to stop, at its heart really is speaking to the idea of don't continue to increase police budgets and instead take that money and put it into giving more support to the communities that have been most harmed by the police, and instead of adding more money, take what's already in existence and revisit it to figure out how to improve upon the systems that are there. And a lot of the principles and details get into ideas of taking some responsibility away from police, because police have to deal with so many things that they are not trained enough in. Police are not trained to be mental health workers. And they have to deal with mental health so much, for so many different reasons. I can't imagine a police officer having to deal with any situation that may be predominantly based off of mental health states and mental health issues, and how they would even figure out how to go about that. It's difficult enough as an educator, doing all the reading and the training and the prep and going to workshops for it that I put into it, the extra hours I put into trying to prepare for that in students in a classroom, let alone a full occupation that offers little to no guidance on it, because it's not considered one of the main things that they should be responsible for, and yet it is one of the largest things they encounter in their job. And so, again, I really bring it back to that. Defund the police is a less sophisticated issue. The statement is a less sophisticated principle, as it is with trying to get across Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. Defund the police doesn't mean defund all money from the police, but stop the idea of just increasing these budgets annually and start revising what's already in place and take that surplus, as others would see it, that increase, and put it into new ideas, put it into change in how money is distributed within police departments and for the police force. This is an extremely conflated idea already. I mean, literally every person out there talking on every show, almost even like from person to person, says something different about this idea, which is why it's a very muddy principle. It's going to be something that needs a lot more fight to gain clarity on its purpose and intentions. And I'll also admit, it almost makes it more difficult to, I think, get that true clarity when we are seeing an extreme be applied in Minneapolis. What's happening in Minneapolis is an extreme. Now, keep in mind, the police statistics in Minneapolis are also extremely dismal. You can go look that up if you want to just kind of go look up the facts of how policing has gone in Minneapolis and in Minnesota over the last, let's just say, decade. It's tough to look at, and it gives a little bit more understanding and as to why they're going for a completely different approach. So we have to also keep that in mind. And this was a thing I had mentioned last week with a friend, and it applies to everything in our situation right now because of our situation right now. And what I mean by that is you have to be very particular about judging one state's approach versus another state. We have 50 states, and then we have other territories that should be states, I'll say, but that's my own 2 cents. And every area, respectfully, every territory, every state has its own issues within its own demographics. Every state has its own issues within its own demographics. And so I really believe this is one of those things that does need to change almost just area to area, demographic to demographic, which is a terrifying thought, except for the fact that we have literally lived that for the last 3 months through this pandemic, that it has been, every state is very different and every area is very different based off of its own demographics. And that's how we've been approaching this pandemic. And it's been absolutely messy and chaotic and difficult and extremely uncomfortable. Welcome to life. This is going to be a part of that great, big, crazy, messy, cosmic experience. Because that's how we learn, that's how we progress, and that's how we keep an acknowledgement of that everyone is in this in a little different situation and with a little different experience. And we have to keep that acknowledgement so that we're actually keeping respect across the board for everyone. It's about trying to do things as respectfully as possible. It is why we're going to have a lot of conversations. It is why we're going to have to correct a lot of people on a lot of things. It's why we are going to have to be corrected on a lot of things. Take a breath. Welcome to life. This is why we're here. This is why we're in it.